Rain hammered against the windshield as David pulled his truck over to the side of the coastal road. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning what should have been a simple drive home into something dangerous. Lightning split the dark sky every few seconds, lighting up the angry ocean below. He'd been working late again at the shipyard, fixing another broken engine. At 34, David had seen every kind of marine equipment problem you could imagine, but right now, all he wanted was to get home safely. The radio crackled with storm warnings, telling people to stay indoors. Through the rain-covered window, something caught his eye. Down by the shore, there was a strange light. Not the usual white foam of crashing waves, but something blue and silver that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. David wiped the fog from his window and looked closer. What he saw made his heart race. There was something in the water near the rocks, something that definitely wasn't a boat. The object was sleek and metallic, about the size of a small yacht, but shaped completely wrong. Its surface seemed to shimmer and change color as the lightning flashed across it. Sparks were flying from what looked like the back of the thing. It was clearly damaged and being pushed toward the sharp rocks by the massive waves. David had spent his whole life around boats and ships, but this was nothing like anything he'd ever seen. His first thought was that it might be some kind of experimental military craft, but as another lightning bolt lit up the sky, he could see strange patterns carved into its surface that seemed to glow with their own light. The hull was smooth in places and covered with symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The craft was in serious trouble. Each wave pushed it closer to the jagged rocks that had destroyed so many ships over the years. Whatever it was, whoever was inside would be in real danger soon. David grabbed his emergency kit from behind the seat. Inside was a strong rope, a powerful flashlight, and some basic rescue gear he always kept handy. Working at the shipyard had taught him to be prepared for anything. He'd helped rescue people from sinking boats before, but never in weather this bad. The wind nearly knocked him over as he stepped out of the truck. The rain felt like tiny needles against his face, and the sound of the storm was almost deafening. But he could still hear something else over the noise, a high-pitched whining sound coming from the strange craft. Getting down to the shore wasn't going to be easy. The cliff was steep and slippery, and one wrong step could send him tumbling onto the rocks below. But David had rock climbed since he was a teenager, and he knew these cliffs better than most people. He tied one end of the rope to his truck's trailer hitch, and tested it to make sure it would hold. The other end went around his waist. Taking a deep breath, he began working his way down the cliff face, using his flashlight to find handholds in the wet rock. The closer he got to the water, the stranger the craft looked. The metal wasn't like anything he'd seen before. It seemed to flow like liquid but was clearly solid. The symbols on its surface were definitely glowing now, pulsing faster as the waves hit it harder. Then he saw movement. A section of the craft's side suddenly opened, not like a door swinging open, but like the metal itself was melting away. Two figures emerged, and David's breath caught in his throat. They weren't human. Both figures were tall and thin, moving with a grace that seemed impossible in the rough water. Their skin had a pale, almost luminescent quality that made them visible even in the darkness. They were identical in every way he could see, like perfect twins. For a moment, David wondered if he was seeing things. Maybe he'd hit his head when he got out of the truck. Maybe the lightning had affected his vision. But as another wave crashed over the failing craft, he saw one of the figures slip and almost fall into the churning water. Training took over. Whatever these beings were in danger, and David knew how to help people in trouble. He positioned himself on a stable ledge about 20 feet above the water and began swinging the loose end of his rope toward the craft. The wind made it difficult, but after several tries, he managed to get the rope close enough for one of the figures to grab it. They moved with incredible speed, securing the rope to something on their craft, and then helping their companion grab hold. Just as they both took hold of the rope, a massive wave lifted the craft and slammed it against the rocks. The sound was like nothing David had ever heard, not the crash of metal against stone, but something more like breaking glass mixed with a musical note that made his teeth ache. He hauled on the rope with everything he had, pulling the two figures up the cliff face as their craft broke apart below them. They weighed less than he'd expected and moved up the rope with an agility that would have been impressive even for trained climbers. When they reached the ledge where David waited, he got his first close look at them. They were definitely not human, but they weren't frightening either. Their large dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed ancient and sad at the same time. Both figures were shaking from the cold, their strange clothes soaked through. They looked at David with expressions that needed no translation, pure gratitude. One of them reached out a long pale hand and touched David's arm gently, as if saying thank you. Another enormous wave crashed against the rocks below, carrying away the last pieces of their craft. Whatever these beings were, wherever they had come from, they were now stranded on Earth. And David was the only person who knew they existed. As the three of them climbed back up the cliff together, David realized his life had just changed forever. He'd gotten up that morning thinking about broken engines and storm warnings. Now he was helping two beings from another world escape a shipwreck. The storm was already beginning to calm as they reached his truck. The strange visitors huddled together in the back seat, still shivering but safe. David started the engine and began driving toward his cabin, his mind racing with questions he couldn't even begin to ask. Behind them, the ocean continued to crash against the rocks, but there was no sign left of the mysterious craft. If David hadn't seen it himself, if he didn't have two impossible passengers in his truck, he might have convinced himself it was all just a storm-induced hallucination. But it was real, all of it. And somehow, David knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple rescue. The drive to David's cabin felt like the longest 20 minutes of his life. Every few seconds, he glanced in the rearview mirror at his passengers. They sat perfectly still, their large dark eyes taking in everything around them. What struck him most was how they seemed to move in perfect sync. Even their breathing matched exactly. His cabin was tucked away in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. David had always liked the privacy, but now he was grateful for it. He had no idea how to explain what had just happened, and he wasn't sure anyone would believe him anyway. As he pulled into his driveway, both visitors turned their heads toward his workshop at exactly the same moment. The building was separate from the main house, filled with tools and equipment from his years of marine repair work. Somehow, they seemed to know that's where they needed to go. David led them inside and turned on the lights. The workshop was warm and dry, with workbenches covered in engine parts and boat equipment. His two guests looked around with obvious interest, their eyes lingering on the various tools and machines. One of them approached his welding station and made a soft sound that might have been approval. The other moved toward a partially disassembled boat engine, studying it with the focused attention of someone who understood machinery. "You're engineers," David said, more to himself than to them. "You understand how things work." Both visitors turned to look at him, and for a moment David felt like they were looking right through him. Then, slowly, they both nodded. The next few hours were unlike anything David had ever experienced. The two beings, he still didn't know what to call them, began trying to communicate. They didn't speak at first, but they were clearly intelligent and determined to make contact. One of them found a piece of paper and began drawing. The sketches were incredibly detailed, showing mathematical equations that David recognized from his engineering training. Then came diagrams of what looked like star maps, with lines connecting different points. The other visitor had found David's computer and somehow figured out how to turn it on. David watched in amazement as long, graceful fingers moved across the keyboard, typing symbols that meant nothing to him but creating patterns that looked almost like music. After about an hour, they seemed to reach some kind of decision. Both visitors placed their hands on David's shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. Suddenly, images flashed through his mind, not quite thoughts, but pictures that told a story. He saw a world of crystal cities and flowing water, beautiful and peaceful. He saw the two beings as children, learning to work with technology that looked like magic. He saw them as adults, preparing for some kind of dangerous mission. Then the images turned dark. David saw other creatures, twisted and wrong, destroying everything in their path. He saw worlds reduced to empty husks, their populations gone. He felt the visitors' fear and determination, their desperate need to warn someone about the approaching danger. When the images stopped, David stumbled backward, his head spinning. The visitors watched him with concern, their expression clearly asking if he was okay. "You're trying to warn us," David said slowly. "Something bad is coming." Both visitors nodded urgently. One of them returned to the paper and began drawing. Again, this time, the sketch showed Earth, with several dark shapes approaching from deep space. The drawing was crude, but the message was clear. Whatever had destroyed their world was heading for Earth. Over the next few hours, David learned more about his unexpected guests. They were part of an advanced civilization that had been monitoring Earth for decades. Their people had strict rules about not interfering with developing worlds, but the approaching threat changed everything. The visitors showed him pieces of technology they'd managed to save from their crashed ship. The devices were unlike anything David had seen, but as an engineer, he could recognize precision and advanced design when he saw it. Working together, they managed to establish a basic communication system. The visitors' names were complex sounds that David couldn't pronounce, so he started thinking of them as the twins. They seemed to understand this and didn't object. Thus the night wore on. David learned that the twins weren't just refugees, they were scouts, sent to evaluate whether Earth's population could be warned and possibly defend themselves. Their mission had been to observe human technology and culture, then report back to their people. The crash had changed everything. Without their ship, they couldn't return home or send their report. But more importantly, they'd detected signs that the enemy creatures they showed him through more mental images were already in the solar system. David saw flashes of these creatures in his mind, and what he saw made him shudder. They were ancient and hungry, consuming not just resources but entire civilizations. They turned living worlds into empty wastelands, leaving nothing behind but dust and darkness. The twins had been tracking this enemy for years, watching them systematically destroy world after world. Earth was next on their list, and without warning, humanity would be completely defenseless. As dawn approached, David realized the full weight of what he'd stumbled into. Two beings from another world were sitting in his workshop, and they were telling him that an invasion was coming. It sounded like something from a science fiction movie, but the evidence was right there in front of him. The twins had managed to create a crude translation device using parts from David's workshop and their own technology. Their first complete sentence in English was simple but terrifying: "They are coming, soon." David looked at his new companions and made a decision that would change his life forever. Whatever was coming, wherever these beings were from, he was going to help them. He'd saved them from the storm, but now it seemed like they might be humanity's only hope of surviving what was coming next. The question was, how do you warn the world about an alien invasion when the only proof you have is to refugees sitting in your workshop? 3 days had passed since David rescued the twins from the storm. Those 3 days changed everything he thought he knew about the world. His workshop had become a makeshift laboratory where human and alien technology came together in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The twins had been working almost non-stop, barely sleeping. They'd built several devices from salvaged parts of their ship and items from David's workshop. One device looked like a cross between a radio and a telescope, constantly scanning the sky for signals. Another projected holographic images that helped them communicate complex ideas. David had taken time off work, telling his boss he had the flu. He couldn't exactly explain that he was helping two aliens prepare for an invasion. The isolation of his cabin had become a blessing. No neighbors to ask awkward questions about the strange lights and sounds coming from his workshop on the third morning. Everything changed. David woke up to find both twins standing perfectly still in the center of his workshop, their eyes closed and their heads tilted toward the ceiling. The scanning device was making a low humming sound that made his teeth ache. "What's happening?" David asked, but he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. The twins opened their eyes simultaneously and looked at him with expressions of pure fear. One of them activated the holographic projector, and suddenly the workshop was filled with a three-dimensional map of the solar system. Red dots were moving through space, approaching Earth from the outer planets. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. As David watched, more dots appeared, forming a pattern that looked like a net closing around Earth. "The scouts," one of the twins said in their improved English. "They have found us." David felt his blood turn cold. The enemy scouts were already here in his solar system, probably looking for the crashed ship and its crew. It was only a matter of time before they found Earth itself. The twins showed him more images through the holographic projector. David saw the enemy up close for the first time, and he wished he hadn't. They were insectoid creatures, twice the size of humans, with multiple arms and eyes that glowed with a cold, hungry light. Their ships were dark and angular, looking more grown than built, but it was what they did to planets that really terrified David. The hologram showed world after world being systematically stripped of everything valuable, not just resources like metals and minerals, but knowledge, culture, even the basic patterns of life itself. "They don't just invade," the other twin explained. "They consume. They take everything that makes a world unique and leave nothing behind but empty rock." David watched in horror as the images showed bustling cities reduced to dust, beautiful landscapes turned into barren wastelands, entire civilizations wiped out not through war, but through systematic harvesting of everything that made them who they were. "How long do we have?" David asked. That the twins consulted their scanning device and exchanged a look that David had learned meant they were communicating without words. Days, maybe a week before the main force arrives. David sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what they were facing. Earth's governments didn't even know aliens existed, let alone that an invasion was coming. The military had weapons designed to fight other humans, not creatures from another world with technology centuries ahead of anything on Earth. But the twins weren't giving up. They'd been working on something, a plan that might give humanity a fighting chance. They showed David a device they'd been building, something that looked like a cross between a satellite dish and a musical instrument. "This is a quantum transmitter," one of them explained. "It can send a message to our homeworld, calling for help." David's heart leaped with hope, but the twins' expression told him it wasn't that simple. The message will take time to reach them, and they will take time to respond. Even if they leave immediately, it will be weeks before help arrives. Weeks. David looked at the holographic display showing enemy ships getting closer every hour. They didn't have weeks. "There's something else," the other twin said. "The transmitter requires a massive amount of energy to work, more than we can generate with our current equipment." David studied the device, his engineer's mind already working on the problem. What kind of energy? Electrical? Nuclear? Something much more complex. It needs to tap into the quantum field that connects all matter in the universe. On our world, we have generators specifically designed for this purpose. Here, the twin gestured helplessly at David's workshop, filled with boat engines and welding equipment. But David was already thinking. He'd spent his whole life solving problems that seemed impossible, finding ways to make broken things work again. This was just another engineering challenge, even if it involved technology he barely understood. "Show me exactly what you need," he said. The next few hours were intense. The twins explained the principles behind their quantum transmitter while David tried to figure out how to adapt Earth technology to make it work. It was like trying to build a computer using stone tools, but gradually, a plan began to form. They would need to raid several locations to get the parts they needed. The local power station had transformers that could be modified. The university physics lab had equipment that could be adapted. Most importantly, there was an old radar installation from the Cold War era that had been abandoned but might still have the kind of high-powered transmitters they needed. As they worked on their plan, the scanning device kept updating their display of approaching enemy ships. The red dots were getting closer, and David could see that some of them were breaking away from the main group, heading directly toward Earth. "The advanced scouts," one of the twins observed. "They're coming to investigate the crash site." David realized they were running out of time. Soon the enemy would know that the twins had survived and were hiding somewhere on Earth. When that happened, they would bring the full force of their invasion fleet to bear. The twins had been monitoring Earth's communication networks, and they'd detected increased military activity. Governments around the world were receiving reports of strange objects in the sky, unexplained radar contacts, and other signs that something unusual was happening. "Your people are beginning to notice," one of the twins said, "but they don't understand what they're seeing." David made a decision that would change everything. They needed to get the quantum transmitter working, but they also needed to start preparing Earth's defenses, and that meant taking a huge risk. "We need to contact someone in authority," he said. "Someone who can mobilize the military and start preparing for what's coming." The twins looked at each other with concern. "If we reveal ourselves to your governance, there's no going back, and if they don't believe us, then we're all dead anyway," David finished. "But if we can convince them, maybe we can buy enough time for help to arrive." As if in response to his words, the scanning device began emitting a high-pitched alarm. On the holographic display, one of the red dots had suddenly accelerated, heading directly toward Earth at incredible speed. "Scout ship," both twins said. "Simultaneously, it will be here in 6 hours." David looked at his alien companions, then at the unfinished transmitter, then back at the approaching threat on the display. 6 hours to finish a device that might save 2 worlds, or to prepare for a battle that humanity couldn't possibly win. The choice was simple, even if the execution would be anything but. The scout ship arrived exactly when the twins predicted. David watched through binoculars as a dark shape moved across the star-filled sky, too fast and too quiet to be anything made on Earth. It circled the area where the alien craft had crashed, scanning the waters with beams of purple light. They'd moved to the old bunker system that David remembered from his childhood. Built during the Cold War, it was designed to survive nuclear attacks and had been forgotten by most people. The thick, concrete walls and deep underground location made it the perfect hiding place. But even 3 stories underground, David could feel the enemy ship's presence. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made his skin crawl. The twins had gone completely silent, their usual telepathic communication replaced by hand signals and worried glances. "It's searching for traces of our ship," one of them whispered. "The quantum signature of our technology leaves a trail that their scanners can follow." David peered at the scanning device they'd brought with them. The display showed the scout ship methodically examining every inch of the coastline. It was only a matter of time before it expanded its search inland. "How long before it finds us?" David asked. "Hours, maybe less, if we use any of our technology." That was a problem. The quantum transmitter was almost finished, but it needed several more hours of work, and without their scanning equipment, they'd be blind to what the enemy was doing. The twins had been working on something else down in the bunker, something they'd been reluctant to explain. Now, with the scout ship overhead, they finally told David what they'd been building. "It's a weapon," one of them said, showing him a device that looked like a cross between a rifle and a musical instrument. "It can disrupt the quantum field that powers their ships." David examined the weapon carefully. It was clearly advanced technology, but it also incorporated parts from his workshop, copper wiring, circuit boards, even pieces of a boat engine. The combination shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did. "We've never seen anything like your approach to engineering," the other twin explained. "Your people solve problems in ways that seem impossible to us. You make things work through intuition and creativity rather than just following established patterns." David felt a strange pride in that assessment. He'd always been good at fixing things, at finding solutions that others missed, but he'd never thought of it as anything special. "The weapon isn't finished," the first twin continued. "It needs something more, something we can't figure out. The quantum field is too complex for our normal methods." They showed David the technical specifications displayed through their holographic projector. The math was beyond him, but the basic principle was simple enough. The weapon would send out a pulse that disrupted the energy field, keeping the enemy ships flying. "It's like jamming a radio signal," David said, beginning to understand. "But instead of blocking sound, you're blocking whatever keeps them in the air." "Exactly, but the timing has to be perfect, and the frequency has to match their ships exactly. One mistake, and the weapon does nothing." David studied the device, his mind racing. The problem wasn't the technology, it was the unpredictability of the target. The enemy ships could change their quantum frequency, adapt to countermeasures, even shut down and restart their systems if they detected interference. "You need something they can't adapt to," he said slowly. "Something that changes faster than they can compensate for." The twins looked at each other, then back at David. "What do you mean?" "Human intuition. You said we solve problems differently than you do. What if that's exactly what this weapon needs?" David explained his idea. The weapon's targeting system needed to be operated by someone who could adapt in real time, who could sense when the enemy was trying to counter their attack and adjust accordingly. But no human could process the quantum calculations fast enough to make those adjustments. "Unless," one of the twins said, understanding dawning in their large eyes. "The human was linked to someone who could handle the calculations, a mind bridge," the other twin added. "We've never done it with a human before, but theoretically," they explained the process to David, and what they told him made his blood run cold. A mind bridge was exactly what it sounded like, a permanent connection between two or more consciousness. The twins had been linked since birth, which was why they moved and thought in perfect synchronization. "If we bridge with you," one of them said, "you would retain your human creativity and intuition, but you would also have access to our knowledge and computational abilities. Together we could operate the weapon with a precision that none of us could achieve alone." David understood immediately why they'd been hesitant to suggest it. The process was irreversible. Once bridged, his mind would be permanently connected to theirs. He would gain their knowledge, but he would also lose something essentially human, the privacy of his own thoughts. "There are other considerations," the second twin said carefully. "The bridge changes you. You would still be David, but you would also be something new, something that has never existed before." David looked at the unfinished weapon, then at the display showing the scout ship getting closer to their location. The choice was becoming clearer by the minute. "What happens to me afterward?" he asked. "Assuming we survive this." The twins exchanged one of their silent communications before answering. "We don't know. No one has ever bridged with a human before. You might become a translator between our species, or you might become something entirely new. The only certainty is that you would never be fully human again." David thought about his life before the storm. His job at the shipyard, his quiet cabin, his routine existence. 3 days ago, that had been enough. Now, Knowing what was coming for Earth, it seemed almost trivial. "How long does the process take?" he asked. "Several hours. And during that time, we'll be completely vulnerable. If the enemy finds us while we're bridging, ... David nodded. He understood the risk. They would have to complete the weapon, bridge their minds, and prepare for battle, all while hiding from an enemy that was actively hunting them. The scanning device suddenly emitted a soft alarm. On the display, the scout ship's search pattern had changed. It was moving inland, following what looked like a systematic grid pattern. "It's found something," one of the twins said. "Traces of our technology, probably from when we built the transmitter." David watched as the enemy ship moved closer to their location. They had maybe an hour before it reached the bunker, maybe less. "We need to decide now," he said. "The bridge, the weapon, all of it. We're out of time." The twins looked at him with expressions that mixed admiration with concern. "You understand what you're giving up. Your human life, your independence, your very identity." David thought about the images he'd seen of dead worlds, of civilizations wiped out by the approaching enemy. He thought about his planet, his species, and the billions of people who had no idea what was coming for them. "I understand," he said. "But I also understand what happens if we don't try. How do we start?" The twins began preparing the bridging equipment, devices that looked like crowns made of crystal and metal. David helped them set up the quantum transmitter and the weapon, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. As the enemy ship drew closer, David lay down on the makeshift table they'd prepared. The twins positioned themselves on either side of him, their own crowns already glowing with soft blue light. "Once we begin, there's no going back," one of them said. David closed his eyes and felt the first tingles of alien consciousness touching his mind. "I know, let's save the world." The bridging process began just as the bunker's outer sensors detected the enemy ship directly overhead. The mind bridge was unlike anything David could have imagined. One moment he was himself, lying on a table in an underground bunker, and the next moment he was everything. His consciousness expanded to include not just his own thoughts and memories, but those of the twins as well. He experienced their childhood on a world of crystal cities and flowing rivers. He felt their terror as the enemy consumed their home planet. He understood their technology not through learning, but through direct experience. At the same time, they gained access to his memories, his emotions, his uniquely human way of solving problems. The process was overwhelming at first, 3 separate minds trying to become one while maintaining their individual identities. David felt like he was drowning in alien thoughts and sensations. But gradually, something amazing happened. Instead of losing himself, he found that he was becoming more than he had been. The twins' knowledge flowed through him, but it was filtered through his human perspective. Complex quantum equations became intuitive. Advanced technology felt as familiar as the tools in his workshop. He could sense the enemy ship above them, feel its quantum signature like a discordant note in a vast symphony. Through the bridge, he realized that the twins were experiencing something similar. His human creativity and adaptability were changing how they processed information. They were seeing solutions they'd never considered before. Approaches that seemed impossible but somehow worked. The transformation was completed, just as the enemy ship found their bunker. David felt the moment when its scanners penetrated the concrete walls, when the creatures inside realized they'd found their prey. But instead of fear, he felt a calm confidence that came from the combined knowledge of 3 minds working as one. "They're coming," he said, but his voice sounded different now, more harmonious, as if 3 people were speaking in perfect unison. The weapon was ready. Through the bridge, David could feel its quantum field generators humming with power. The targeting system was unlike anything that had ever existed, part alien technology, part human engineering, and part something entirely new that had emerged from their mental connection. Above them, the enemy ship landed with a sound like breaking glass. David could sense the creatures inside preparing to breach the bunker's defenses. They were confident. These ancient predators, they'd done this countless times before on countless worlds, but they'd never faced anything like what waited for them below. The bunker's outer door exploded inward with a blast of purple energy. The creatures that poured through were even more terrifying in person than they'd been in the holographic displays. They moved with a mechanical precision that spoke of eons of conquest and destruction. David raised the weapon, and through the bridge he felt the twins' knowledge guiding his aim. The quantum targeting system locked onto the enemy ship's power source, calculating frequencies and compensating for quantum fluctuations in real time. The weapon fired. The pulse that emerged was invisible to human eyes, but David could feel it through the bridge. It struck the enemy ship like a hammer blow, disrupting the quantum field that kept it aloft. The massive vessel crashed to the ground with a sound like thunder. But the creatures inside the bunker were still coming. David found himself moving, with inhuman speed and precision, the weapon adapting to each target as if it were reading his thoughts, which, in a way, it was. The battle was brief but intense. The enemy had expected to find confused, frightened refugees. Instead, they found something they'd never encountered before, a hybrid consciousness that combined the best of both species. When the last creature fell, David stood in the ruins of the bunker, breathing hard but victorious, through the bridge. He could feel the twins' amazement at what they'd accomplished. "We did it," he said, and realized he was speaking in harmony with voices that weren't quite his own. But the victory was just the beginning. The quantum transmitter was still sending its message to the twins' home world, but the response would take weeks to arrive. The enemy's main fleet was still approaching, and now they knew that their scouts had been destroyed. David found himself at the center of humanity's first contact with alien intelligence. His transformation had created something unprecedented, a being who could communicate perfectly with both species, who understood both human nature and alien technology. The world's governments were initially skeptical when he made contact. A marine engineer from a small coastal town claiming to have alien allies seemed impossible, but when David demonstrated technology that was centuries ahead of anything on Earth, they began to listen. The bridge had given him more than just knowledge. It had given him the ability to see connections that others missed, to find solutions that seemed impossible. Working with Earth's scientists and military leaders, he helped develop defenses that combined human creativity with alien technology. The battle for Earth, when it came, was unlike anything in human history. The enemy arrived expecting to find a primitive world ripe for conquest. Instead, they found a planet defended by weapons that shouldn't have existed, operated by people who understood their technology better than they did themselves. David stood on the bridge of humanity's first interstellar vessel, watching the defeated enemy fleet retreat into deep space. The bridge had made him something new, not fully human, not fully alien, but something that connected both worlds. The victory had come at a cost. David could never return to his old life. The quiet marine engineer who'd rescued 2 aliens from a storm no longer existed. In his place was something unprecedented. A bridge between species, carrying the hopes and knowledge of both worlds within his transformed consciousness. But as he looked out at the stars, feeling the twins' presence in his mind like a constant, comforting song, David knew he'd made the right choice. The old David might have lived a simple, quiet life. This new David had helped save 2 civilizations. The twins' homeworld had finally sent a response to the quantum transmission. Their rescue fleet was approaching Earth, not to save refugees, but to meet with humanity's representatives. The age of isolation was over for both species. "What happens now?" David asked, speaking to the twins through the bridge, to the human officials around him, and to himself all at once. "Now we explore the galaxy together," came the reply, in voices that were his and not his. Familiar and alien, human and something entirely new. David smiled, feeling the response echo through the bridge to his alien companions. The storm that had brought them together seemed like a lifetime ago. He'd lost his human life, but he'd gained something far more valuable, the chance to help 2 species reach for the stars together. As Earth's first interstellar vessel engaged its quantum drives and leaped toward the stars, David knew that his real adventure was just beginning. The rescue had ended, but the partnership would last forever.